At 11:57 p.m., the prison doesn't feel loud. It feels heavy. Fluorescent lights hum softly above concrete floors that have seen decades of footsteps. Guards changing shifts, lawyers pacing nervously, inmates counting time by heartbeats instead of clocks. Somewhere beyond steel doors and reinforced glass, a man waits, not for freedom, not for mercy, but for an ending that has been scheduled, delayed, debated, and argued over for more than 30 years. This is not a story about speed. This is a story about waiting. Mark Allen Geralds has been on death row longer than some of the guards escorting him have been alive. He has watched governors change, laws evolve, execution methods rewritten, and public opinion twist back on itself like a tightening knot. He has eaten thousands of meals in a cell no bigger than a parking space. He has survived appeals, denials, and the strange psychological limbo of knowing the state intends to kill you, just not yet. Tonight, that limbo ends. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Death row is often imagined as a single hallway with cells and bars. That image is wrong. Death row is a system within a system, a psychological pressure chamber designed not only to hold a person, but to stretch time until it loses meaning. In the prison where Mark Allen Geralds spent most of his adult life, death row inmates were kept in near constant isolation, 23 hours a day inside a cell, 1 hour to shower, pace, or stare at the sky through a chain-link fence layered with razor wire. No programs, no work details, no chance of parole, just routine. Morning counts, evening counts, meals slid through slots, conversations conducted by shouting through vents or tapping on walls in code. Years pass not by calendars, but by the faces of guards who retire, get promoted, or stop showing up altogether. And in that environment, time becomes a weapon. For Mark, death row wasn't about fear of dying tomorrow. It was about the exhaustion of knowing you could die any day, and being told repeatedly that today was not that day. Long before death row, before court transcripts and evidentiary photos, Mark Allen Geralds was a name known only to a small circle of people. He grew up in a working-class environment marked by instability, broken authority, and long stretches without supervision. Teachers describe him as quiet but distant. Neighbors would later say he was there, but not really there. What matters in a case like this isn't whether that background excuses what happened. It doesn't. But whether it explains how a life reached a point where violence intersected with opportunity. Mark drifted as a young adult. Short-term jobs, short-term relationships, a record that didn't shock police, but didn't worry them enough either. Until the night everything changed. Because most executions don't start with prison gates. They start with one decision, often made in minutes, that echoes for decades. The crime tied to Mark Allen Geralds shocked the community. It came from not because it happened, but because of how it happened. According to investigators, the incident involved betrayal, someone known, someone trusted, and a situation that escalated faster than anyone anticipated. Prosecutors later argued it was intentional, controlled, and deliberate. The defense would counter that it was chaotic, impulsive, and fueled by emotional instability. The truth, like in many capital cases, lived in the margins between those two narratives. Evidence was circumstantial in some areas, direct in others. Witnesses remembered fragments. Timelines shifted. A few critical moments were reconstructed from inference rather than observation. But in a system designed to seek final answers, the jury was asked a single question. Did Mark Allen Geralds deserve to die for this? And after days of deliberation, they answered yes. That verdict didn't end the story. It only slowed it down. When the judge read the sentence, Mark Allen Geralds didn't collapse. He didn't lash out. Witnesses noted something more unsettling, calm. Not peace, but shock disguised as stillness. The kind of silence that settles when a person realizes their life has been divided into before and after. He was processed into the prison system within weeks. Chains, transport vans, intake photographs, medical screenings, and finally, a cell assigned not by number alone but by destiny. Death row, From that moment forward, Mark's relationship with time changed forever. Appeals began almost immediately. Automatic reviews required in capital cases. New lawyers entered the picture. Motions were filed. Errors were argued. Evidence was re-examined under microscopes both literal and legal. Years passed. Execution dates were set then stayed. Set again. Stayed again. Each stay of execution was framed as hope by outsiders. For inmates like Mark, it often felt like something else entirely. Psychologists who have studied death row describe a condition that doesn't fit neatly into textbooks. A blend of chronic stress, anticipatory grief, emotional numbness, and survival instinct fighting each other in the same mind. Mark Allen Geralds adapted. At first, letters became his lifeline. Family, advocates, occasionally journalists. Over time, fewer envelopes arrived. Interest fades. Public outrage moves on. Cases age. Names are forgotten. Guards notice changes. Weight fluctuations. Sleep disturbances. Periods of isolation followed by sudden talkativeness. He read obsessively. Law books, philosophy, anything that offered structure. But there was one thing Mark avoided discussing. His death. On death row, talking about your execution can make it feel more real. And some inmates survive by refusing to give the inevitable a voice. To understand Mark's final days, you have to understand the prison itself. This facility was designed not for rehabilitation, but for containment. Concrete reinforced with steel. Windows designed to allow light, not escape. Movement controlled by buzzers, cameras, and layered authorization. Every execution required coordination across departments, medical staff, administration, legal observers, spiritual advisors. The prison transformed subtly before an execution. Extra guards, restricted movement, a quiet tension that spread through the building like a weather front. Death row inmates could feel it when an execution approached, even if it wasn't theirs. And when it was yours, the atmosphere changed entirely. Decades after the original sentence, Mark Allen Geralds faced his last appeals. The arguments were technical now. Procedural fairness, ineffective counsel claims, shifts in how courts viewed certain types of evidence. Each filing was thinner than the last, not because they mattered less, but because there was less left to argue. Courts denied relief. One by one, the final warrant was signed. For the first time in years, there was no legal buffer left between Mark and the execution chamber. The date was real. The time was fixed. In the final week, routines change. An inmate is allowed more visits. Counsel checks in even when there is nothing left to say. A chaplain offers conversations that circle around meaning, regret, and acceptance without ever forcing conclusions. Mark's demeanor puzzled some staff. He wasn't outwardly panicked, but he wasn't calm either. He asked for small things, specific books, certain meals. He wrote letters, slowly, deliberately, choosing words that could not be revised once they left his hands. Because finality does something strange to language. Every sentence starts to feel permanent. Popular culture obsesses over last meals. But in reality, many condemned inmates barely touch the food. The meal offered to Mark Allen Geralds followed standard protocol. Nothing extravagant. Nothing symbolic from the state's perspective. What mattered more wasn't what he ordered, but what he left untouched. Food is about future energy. And in the final hours, the body knows there is no future to prepare for. As midnight approached, the prison entered procedural lockstep. Witnesses were gathered. Paperwork was checked. Equipment was inspected multiple times. Not because mistakes were common, but because mistakes here are unforgivable. Mark was escorted from his cell with practiced formality. No rushing. No unnecessary words. This part of the system ran on scripts learned over years. But even the best script cannot eliminate humanity from a room. In most executions, final words are optional. Some inmates refuse to speak. Others apologize. Some protest innocence until the end. What Mark Allen Geralds chose to say would later divide opinion. Some heard remorse. Others heard deflection. A few heard something else entirely. A man speaking not to the room, but to the decades he had already survived. His words would be recorded, archived, and replayed in documentaries like this one, not because they change what happened, but because they force us to confront what punishment, time, and closure really mean. There's no dramatic soundtrack inside a prison, no echoing footsteps, no cinematic pauses. When Allen Geralds was escorted from the holding area toward the execution chamber, it happened with the same controlled efficiency the institution used for everything else. The difference was not in the movement. It was in the meaning attached to every step. This walk had been rehearsed in policy manuals, practiced by staff, and refined over decades. Yet for Mark, each pace carried the accumulated weight of 30-plus years of waiting. His shackles were standard issue. His posture was steady. But witnesses would later remark on one detail. He kept his eyes forward, refusing to look at the walls he had stared at for most of his adult life. For the first time in decades, there was no reason to memorize a room. Execution chambers are often described clinically: sterile, quiet, controlled. That description misses something essential. The chamber is not powerful because of what happens there, but because of what led there. It represents the full authority of the state brought to a single moment. Every arrest report, every court transcript, every appeal denial converges into one space where nothing further can be argued. For Allen Geralds, the chamber wasn't unfamiliar. He had imagined it countless times, sometimes in nightmares, sometimes an idle thought during endless nights on death row. But imagination cannot fully prepare you for the finality of standing in a room where time no longer extends beyond minutes. Witnesses were seated behind glass. Officials nodded to each other. The process moved forward. When offered the chance to speak, Allen Geralds did not hesitate. His voice, by all accounts, was measured, not loud, not trembling. The kind of voice that comes from someone who has spent decades practicing conversations in their head with no one else present. He spoke about time, about how years can punish a person long, before any execution ever does. He addressed those connected to the case, choosing words that neither fully confessed nor completely denied guilt. Instead, he spoke about regret in a broader sense, regret for the damage caused, for the lives changed forever, for the version of himself that existed before the crime and the version that survived after it. Some listeners heard remorse. Some heard avoidance. Others heard something more unsettling. A man who had lived so long under the shadow of death that the event itself had lost its power over him. Because after decades on death row, the execution can feel less like a beginning or an end, and more like the final line of the sentence already served. Outside the prison walls, time is measured by seconds. Inside, it is measured by procedures. At each checkpoint, confirmation was given. Names were read. Roles were acknowledged. The system did what was designed to do: remove uncertainty. Allen Geralds did not struggle. That fact would later become part of the discussion, part of the mythos surrounding the case. Some saw it as acceptance. Others saw it as resignation. But those who have studied death row psychology note something else entirely. When a person waits long enough, resistance can feel unnecessary. The fight is already behind them. Executions, despite their cultural portrayal, are not dramatic events. They are quiet. They are procedural. And they are over faster than most people expect. There was no grand declaration from the state. No reaction shot from the condemned. Just a sequence of actions performed by professionals trained not to react emotionally, because emotion complicates consistency. In minutes, it was finished. The man who had entered the prison system decades earlier exited history as a case file closed with the time of death. What happens after an execution is rarely discussed. The prison does not pause. Count continues. Doors still open and close. Inmates return to routine, though many report an unspoken heaviness that lingers in the air. On death row, other inmates process reality differently. Some prayed. Some stayed silent. A few became more withdrawn, because even when it isn't your execution, it is a reminder that the process does move forward eventually. For guards, the shift continued. Reports were completed. Procedures documented. Another date was quietly erased from a calendar. The system absorbed the event and kept going. Outside the prison, reaction fractured immediately. Some saw justice fulfilled at last, an overdue consequence carried out after decades of delay. Victims' families express relief, exhaustion, closure, or a complicated mixture of all three. Others question the morality of executing someone after allowing them to age, change, and spend most of their life already imprisoned. Editorials debated whether decades on death row constituted an additional punishment beyond the sentence itself. Mark Allen Geralds' name resurfaced briefly. Then, as with most executions, attention moved on. But not everyone let the story end there. Long after the execution, legal scholars revisited aspects of the case, not to overturn the outcome, but to examine the process. A witness statement that had shifted subtly over time. An interpretation of forensic evidence that relied heavily on standards no longer used today. None of it was enough to change what had already happened, but it raised an uncomfortable question that appears in many long-delayed executions. If the case were tried today, would the outcome be the same? That question has no legal power after an execution, only moral weight. Perhaps the most haunting part of the story isn't the crime or the execution. It's the transformation that occurred in between. Letters written in later years showed a different man than the one described in early police reports. More reflective, more controlled, less impulsive. Whether this change represented genuine growth or survival adaptation is impossible to determine, but it feeds into the central dilemma of capital punishment after decades. Are we executing the person who committed the crime, or the person shaped by decades of punishment? In Mark's case, the answer arrived too late to matter. Every long-term death row case tells two stories. One is about guilt, innocence, and accountability. The other is about time, what it does to a human mind when tomorrow is promised, then taken away, then offered again. Mark Allen Geralds lived long enough to become older than many of his original jurors. Long enough to watch technology evolve, laws change, and public discourse shift around the very punishment he was condemned to. When his execution finally occurred, it felt less like an event, and more like the closing of a chapter no one knew how to end. What stayed with people wasn't the execution itself. It was the waiting. Decades of suspended life. Decades of unanswered internal questions. Decades where punishment occurred slowly, invisibly, and legally. Mark Allen Geralds' final words did not rewrite his story, but they forced listeners to confront something uncomfortable. That justice, when delayed long enough, begins to resemble something else entirely. Not mercy, not cruelty, but endurance. For some connected to the case, the execution of Mark Allen Geralds brought a sense of finality. Not relief, not joy, but an end to something that had dragged on for so long it shaped entire lives. Families had aged. Memories had blurred. Grief had evolved from raw pain into something quieter and heavier. Yet even among those who believed the sentence was justified, there was an unexpected emptiness afterward. Because no execution restores what was lost. It only confirms that the state considers the debt paid. For others, legal observers, advocates, even some prison staff, the case left behind unresolved questions, not about guilt alone, but about whether a punishment that stretches across decades becomes something fundamentally different from what was originally intended. Mark Allen Geralds died as the law allowed, but he also lived under that law for most of his life. And that reality complicated the meaning of justice for everyone who looked closely enough. When history remembers cases like this, it rarely remembers the exact words spoken in the chamber. It remembers the time. 30 years on death row. Thousands of days waiting for an ending that never arrived. Until suddenly, it did. Mark Allen Geralds' execution closed a file, but opened a conversation that still hasn't found an answer. One about what society wants punishment to accomplish. One about whether justice delayed becomes justice transformed. And one about how many lives, not just one, are shaped when the state decides that death is the only acceptable conclusion. Because in the end, this story isn't only about the moment a man died. It's about the decades he lived knowing how it would end. And that may be the most unsettling sentence of all.